It's been said a number of times that war is hell. I mean, even I've said it. Stories about war are often harrowing tales of human drama, plumbing the darkest depths of our psyche, stressing our psychological fortitude, and testing the limits of what horrors humanity can endure and still maintain some shred of the decency, the sense of good, the very essence or soul necessary to continue to call itself human. There are those stories, and then there's MASH.
MASH, a motion picture that raises some important moral questions. And then it drops them.
What are you two hoodlums doing in this hospital?
Look, Mother, I want to go to work in 1 hour. We are the pros from Dover.
Somebody get that dirty old man out of this operating theater.
And then give me at least one nurse who knows how to work in close without getting her tits in my way.
I wonder how a degenerated person like that could have reached a position of responsibility in the Army Medical Corps.
He was drafted.
This isn't a hospital! It's an insane asylum!
In 1951, the Korean War is in full swing when two new surgeons joined the 4077th Mobile Surgical Army Hospital near the front lines of the conflict. Surrounded by a cast of characters that would rather be literally anywhere else doing literally anything else, they are dedicated to saving lives and inebriated to save their sanity. Director Robert Altman directs from a screenplay by Ring Lardner Jr. The movie stars Donald Sutherland, Elliot Gould, Tom Skerritt, Sally Kellerman, Robert Duvall, Roger Bowen, Renee Auberjonois, David Harkin, and a whole bunch of others. The film was produced by Aspirin Productions, Ingo Preminger Productions, and 20th Century Fox. The film was distributed by 20th Century Fox in the US and has a runtime of 116 minutes. Based on the 1968 novel by Richard Hooker, a pen name for Dr. Richard H. Hornberger and writer W.C. Hines, and produced 2 years before the arguably better-known TV series, MASH is a stellar example of the difference between a self-aware film comedy and a film that is just funny. There are no real setup, payoff actions, or out-and-out jokes on display like you might find in more modern comedic experiences. The film's humor is generated by the characters' attempts to deal with or just avoid their conditions and, at times, one another. Clashing personalities and a heavy disdain for being forced to participate in the conflict lead the characters to a lot of boozing and canoodling carried out under the umbrella defense of what happens in Korea stays in Korea, unless it also happens in Japan. The movie is heavily grounded in a fairly realistic depiction of the conditions present in the field hospitals of the Korean War, mobile tent villages near the front lines that service the wounded during and directly following combat. They needed to be able to move quickly as the action toured around the country like a pad bar band no one wants to see. So these camps were erected with haste and were generally pretty shoddy spaces where doctors tried their damnedest to save as many lives as they could with the surgical equivalent of a ball of yarn and a box full of Tampax. Director Altman and director of photography Harold E. Stein create a very natural-looking image shot on 35mm and presented at the 2:35 scope aspect ratio. The image is captured in a lot of natural light, though through kind of a slight haze, like the fog of war or maybe nostalgia. See, the choice of 2:35 scope over 185 flat for presentation allowed director Altman to frame his multiple characters in the world with a lot of surrounding details so environments never become abstractions. It's important that we always remember where and when we are. The camera doesn't draw much attention to itself, and while there certainly are some moments of subjectivity, it's mostly an unseen observer in the world. While it isn't impossible to create a good film comedy from subjective viewpoint, see Planes, Trains, and Automobiles for an example of subjective comedy done very well, it's difficult to create a subjective experience when you don't have a specific enough character perspective to lens it through. Had MASH focused on a single character's perspective, say Gary Berghoff's Radar as a young enlisted man, it would have been a very different shared experience. The film isn't driven by imagery. It isn't even driven by plot, by which to say there really isn't one except in the most basic of terms. The presentation is a series of vignettes occurring during the 5-month deployment of two of the main characters, Sutherland's Hawkeye Pierce and Skerritt's Duke Forrest. The events themselves are fairly inconsequential as they might pertain to the building of a specific story. The focus of the film is on the observational experience, letting the audience sit in on what it was like, according to the novels based on real event storytelling, for the surgeons near the front at the time. Director Altman keeps an even, upbeat pace to the film while the humor stays grounded in the characters. Shortly after opening, we are thrown right into the film's unique voice and oddball sense of humor with an exchange captured in wide that is very natural and unpunctuated by stylized filmmaking. There are no set pieces to speak of, no humorous situations that the characters are thrown into for the purpose of generating laughs. The humor isn't subtle, far from it, but it is solidly rooted in the characters' personalities, the clashes of those personalities, and the fun of watching eccentric people act in an eccentric manner. Being a surgical hospital, the MASH unit is still host to some frank scenes of what the television series would go on to call meatball surgery. The film doesn't focus on the medical side, but it treats the subject with respect, and the doctors are shown to be as deeply committed to their jobs as they are to their after-shift martinis. However, even with their turning the chopper pad into a makeshift driving range, the philandering and practical jokes at the expense of the head nurse, the film makes sure you know the real world is out there. The film opens on choppers bringing wounded to the camp and continues to impress upon the audience the reality of issues like the doctors having to basically steal a hospital room to perform life-saving surgery on a half-white, half-Japanese baby no one else would touch, or being called from Korea to Japan to operate on a soldier's minor training wound just because his father's a congressman. Two of the film's most powerful moments come near the end, one with Gould's Trapper and Sutherland's Hawkeye actively avoiding the sight of a corpse being driven out of camp, and the second a flash of fantasy Scarrett's Duke has when he gets word that his orders have come in and he's being discharged. Both of these moments are impacting pieces of the experience these doctors had, and likely continue to have as we find ourselves dragging bloody corpses around the world to this day. It might not be a film about humanity during a time of war, but it is still a film about humanity set during a time of war. The strength of the presentation lay in its feeling of realness contrasted against the frankly unbelievable antics of its characters. The performers rarely go for the laugh and play with very subtle self-awareness of their nature as a comedic ensemble, only occasionally stepping out into, quote, being funny. The production design is gorgeous in all of its olive drab and dirt brown splendor, and there doesn't seem to be much of an attempt to romanticize or dramatize the world of the film. You'll often find scenes captured with an almost documentary eye in the cinema verite style that was bubbling up around that time. There's no greater commentary being foisted upon the audience about the nature of war and its effects on the soul of mankind. It's not pro-war or anti-war. In fact, the war is very far from the events of the film outside of the occasional need to put some poor kid's body back together with the aforementioned yarn and Tampax. It's more about how people deal with the boredom and monotony of this forced service in isolation, and the bonds they create with the people they have to share it with. The characters justify all sorts of ludicrous behavior even they admit would never fly at home. But the Looney Tunes nature of it all is in service of a very real need. The idea that sometimes, in order to maintain your sanity, you just have to go a little bit insane. I used to watch the MASH TV show with my parents, and to this day it's one of my mother's favorite programs, so the specific tone and iconography of that material is part of my DNA. Though I'd seen MASH the movie in the past in pieces, it was nice to finally sit down and have a watch all in one go. If you've ever seen the television adaptation, it takes a lot of cues from the film, except it's not quite as bawdy. By today's standards, most of the humor in the film would be considered pretty tame, but there are still a few bits that might get on top of some people given the generational divide. I was 6 years from my premiere date when the movie was released, and I could, in theory, have adult children now if I was either a little more or a little less crazy. There are a few choice elements in the film that would definitely get one canceled these days. I'm no shrinking violet, and language rarely offends me, and it didn't here to be clear, but I made note of it nonetheless. If you're going to give the film a try, you have to remember the movie was made in goddamn 1970. Give it a little fucking latitude. It was interesting to me that the characters pretty much just existed within the performances. Sure, they were based on the characters in the books, which were in turn based on real people, but that's pretty irrelevant. None of them have much in the way of backstories or forestories or any kind of stories. Who they were before they came into the war and who they would go back to being once they left doesn't matter. They simply exist in this place and time with a feeling of three-dimensionality that can only come from great performers, particularly from Sutherland and Gould, who really become the film's central characters. I didn't find the movie to be a laugh riot all throughout, but it is frequently very funny. It never reaches the same dramatic heights as the television series, but the movie and the show have two very different goals for their storytelling and really shouldn't be compared against one another. I thought the authenticity of the production design was fantastic, and the score from Johnny Mandel added the appropriate amount of Looney Tunes zing at times. Overall, I really feel like it's a unique piece of film history that managed to stand apart from the more well-known adaptation as an individual experience. MASH isn't going to be a movie for everyone at this point in time. Many of the characters and their associated humors would likely no longer be considered acceptable if they ever really were. It's a piece very much of its time, and it feels like it top to bottom. But the film is also very funny, with uniformly good performances and a unique voice. Movies like Private Benjamin and Stripes tickled at the hindquarters of the film a decade later, but they were both far more plot-driven. And unlike MASH, their existence as post-Vietnam productions, along with films like An Officer and a Gentleman and Taps, made it difficult for those movies to be as openly disrespectful to the military, and they avoid many of the same concepts and conflicts by presenting stories of soldiers in training who would never likely see combat. MASH is not one of those important movies to see before you die kind of films, but it is part of a period in US film history influenced either consciously or unconsciously by the growing dissatisfaction with its involvement in the Vietnam War. It's a movie I would feel very comfortable recommending to anyone looking for a solid film comedy that can make you laugh without desperately seeming like it's trying to make you laugh. I think the movie's attitude can be easily summed up by the sage words from one Dr. Sidney Freedman.
Ladies and gentlemen, take my advice. Pull down your pants and slide on the ice.